Hello, this is Mrs. Chavez. We're still in Chapter 2, and we're the intro to the early river valley civilizations. In this section, 2.2, we're going to be looking at Egypt and the pyramids on the Nile. To the west of the Fertile Crescent in Africa, another river makes its way to the sea. While Sumerian civilization was on the rise, a similar process took place along the banks of this river, the Nile, in Egypt. Yet the Egyptian civilization turned out to be very different from the collection of city-states in Mesopotamia. Early on, Egypt was united into a single kingdom, which allowed it to enjoy a high degree of unity, stability, and cultural continuity over a period of 3,000 years. From the highlands of East Africa to the Mediterranean Sea, the Nile River flows northward across Africa for over 4,100 miles, making it the longest river in the world. A thin ribbon of water and a parched desert on either side, and the great river brings its water to Egypt from distant mountains and plateaus and lakes in present-day Burundi, Tanzania, Uganda, and Ethiopia. Egypt's settlements arose along the Nile on a narrow strip of land made fertile by the river. The change from fertile soil to desert, from the black land to the red land, was so abrupt that a person could stand with one foot in each. As in Mesopotamia, yearly flooding brought the water and rich soil that allowed settlements to grow. Every year in July, rains and a melting snow from the mountains of East Africa caused the Nile River to rise and spill over its banks. When the river receded in October, it left behind a rich deposit of fertile black mud called silt. Before the scorching sun could dry out the soil, the peasants would prepare their wheat and barley fields. All fall and winter, they watered their crops from a network of irrigation ditches. In an otherwise parched land, the abundance brought by the Nile was so great that the Egyptians worshipped it as a god who gave life and seldom turned against them. As the ancient Greek historian Herodotus remarked in the 5th century BCE, Egypt was the gift of the Nile. Egyptian farmers were much more fortunate than the villagers of Mesopotamia. Compared to the unpredictable Tigris and Euphrates River, the Nile was as regular as clockwork. Even so, life in Egypt had its risk. When the Nile's floodwaters were just a few feet lower than normal, the amount of fresh silt and water for crops was greatly reduced. Thousands of people would have starved. When floodwaters were a few feet higher than usual, the unwanted water destroyed houses, granaries, and the precious seeds that farmers needed for planting. The vast and forbidding deserts on either side of the Nile acted as a natural barrier between Egypt and other lands. They forced Egyptians to live on a very small portion of the land and reduced interaction with other people. However, the desert shut out invaders. For much of its early history, Egypt was spared the constant warfare that plagued the Fertile Crescent and Mesopotamia. Ancient Egyptians lived along the Nile from the mouth well into the interior of Africa. River travel was so common, but it ended at the point of the Nile where the boulders turned the river into churning rapids called cataracts. This made it impossible for riverboats to pass the spot known as the First Cataract to continue upstream south to the interior of Africa. It also acted as a great barrier. Between the First Cataract and the Mediterranean lay two very different regions. Because its elevation is higher, the river area in the south is called Upper Egypt. It's a skinny strip of land from the First Cataract to the point where the river starts to fan out into many branches. To the north, near the sea, Lower Egypt includes the Nile Delta region. The delta begins about 100 miles before the river enters the Mediterranean Sea. And the delta is a broad, marshy, kind of triangular. If you take a look over here, this whole area here is where the delta is. It's kind of like a triangle. And then these spill into the Mediterranean Sea here. So here's Upper Egypt, and here's Lower Egypt, because it's flowing northward. It's coming from the mountains here, working its way down, flowing north, which is unusual also. Most rivers flow south to the equator. This one flows north to the equator, all the way to the marsh, to the delta, and then out into the Mediterranean Sea. Okay? So the Nile provided a reliable system of transportation between Upper and Lower Egypt. The Nile flows north, so northbound boats simply drifted with the current. Southbound boats put up a wide sail. The prevailing winds of Egypt blow from north to south, carrying sailboats against the river current. The ease of contact made it possible by this watery highway helped unify Egypt's villages and promote trade. Egyptians lived in farming villages as far back as 5000 BCE, and perhaps even earlier. Each village had its own rituals, gods, and chieftain. By 3200 BCE, the villages of Egypt were under the rule of two separate kingdoms, Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. Eventually, the two kingdoms were united. There's conflicting historical evidence over who united Upper and Lower Egypt. Some evidence points to a king called Scorpion, but there's more solid evidence that points to a king named Narmer. The king of Lower Egypt wore a red crown, and the king of Upper Egypt wore a tall white crown shaped like a bowling pin. A carved piece of slate known as the Narmer palette. If you take a look at it, this is the Narmer palette here. And it basically shows you, let's see, here is the one that looks like the bowling pin, and here is the other one. Okay, so on one side is the crown of the Upper Egypt, and on the other side is the crown for Lower Egypt, indicating that they were united and that he was king over the upper and the lower. So Narmer created a double crown from the red and white crowns, and it symbolized a united kingdom. He shrewdly settled his capital, Memphis, near the spot where the Upper and Lower Egypt met, and established the first Egyptian dynasty. Eventually, the history of ancient Egypt would consist of 31 dynasties spanning 2,600 years. Historians suggest that the pattern of Egypt's great civilization was set during the period from 3200 down to 2700 BCE. The period from 2660 to 2180 BCE is known as the Old Kingdom and marks a time when these patterns became widespread. Like the Mesopotamians, the early Egyptians were polytheistic, believing in many gods. The most important gods were Ra, the sun god, and Osiris, the god of the dead. The most important goddess was Isis, who represented the ideal mother and wife. In all, Egyptians worshipped more than 2,000 gods and goddesses. They built huge temples to honor their major deities. In contrast to the Mesopotamians with their bleak view of death, Egyptians believed in an afterlife. It's a life that continues after they die, similar to the life they had when they were alive. Egyptians believed they would be judged for their deeds when they died. Anubis is the god and guide of the underworld, and he would weigh each dead person's heart. To win eternal life, the heart could be no heavier than a feather. If the heart tipped the scales, showing that it was heavier with sin, a fierce beast known as the devourer of the soul would pounce on the impure heart and gobble it up. But if the soul passed this test for purity and truth, it would live forever in the beautiful other world. So people of all classes planned for their burial so they might safely reach the other world. Kings and queens built great tombs, such as the pyramids, and other Egyptians built smaller tombs. Royal and elite Egyptians' bodies were preserved by mummification, which involves embalming and drying the corpse to prevent from decaying. Scholars still accept Herodotus' description of the process of mummification as one of the methods used by the Egyptians. He said, first they draw out the brains through the nostril with an iron hook. Then, with a sharp stone, they make an incision on the side and take out all of the bowels. Then, having filled the belly with pure myrrh, cassia, and other perfumes, they sew it up again, and when they have done this, they steep it in a natron, it's a mineral salt, leaving it under for 70 days. At the end of 70 days, they wash the corpse and wrap the whole body in bandages of wax and cloth. Attendants place the mummy in a coffin inside of a tomb. Then they filled the tomb with items that the dead person could use in the afterlife, such as clothing and food, cosmetics and jewelry. Many Egyptians purchased scrolls that contained hymns and prayers and magic spells intended to guide the soul in the afterlife. This collection of text is also known as the Book of the Dead. Like the grand monuments to the kings, Egyptian society formed a pyramid. The king and queen and royal family stood at the very top. Below them were the other members of the upper class, which included the wealthy landowners and government officials, priests and army commanders. And the next tier of the pyramid was the middle class, which included merchants and artisans. At the base of the pyramid, which was the largest, was the lower class, and this was by far the largest class of people. It consisted of peasant farmers and laborers, and in later periods of Egyptian history, slavery became a widespread source of labor. Slaves usually were captives from foreign wars and served in the homes of the rich or toiled endlessly in the gold mines of Upper Egypt. The Egyptians were not locked into their social classes. Lower and middle class Egyptians could gain higher status through marriage or success in their jobs, especially scribes. Even some of the slaves could hope to earn their freedom as a reward for their loyal service. To win the highest possible position, people had to be able to read and write. Once a person had these skills, many careers were open in the army, the royal treasury, the priesthood, and the king's court. Women in Egypt held many of the same rights as men. For example, a wealthy or middle-aged woman could own and trade property. She could propose marriage or seek divorce. If she were granted a divorce, she would be entitled to a third of the couple's property. As in Mesopotamia, the development of writing was one of the keys to the growth of Egyptian civilization. Simple pictographs were the earliest form of writing in Egypt, but scribes quickly developed a more flexible writing system called hieroglyphics. This term comes from the Greek words hieros and glyph, meaning sacred carving. As with the Sumerian cuneiform writing, in the earliest forms of hieroglyphic writing, a picture stood for an idea. For instance, a picture of a man stood for the idea of a man. In time, the system changed so that the picture stood for sound as well as ideas. The owl, for example, stood for the M sound or for the bird itself. Although hieroglyphs were first written on stone and clay, as in Mesopotamia, the Egyptians soon invented better writing surface, papyrus reeds. These grew in the marshy delta. The Egyptians split the reeds into narrow strips, placed them crosswise in 2 layers, dampened them, and then pressed. As the papyrus dried, the plant's sap glued the strips together into paper-like sheets. The role of the king was one striking difference between Egypt and Mesopotamia. In Mesopotamia, kings were considered to be representatives of the gods. To the Egyptians, kings were gods. The Egyptian god-king, called pharaohs, were thought to be almost as splendid and powerful as the gods of the heavens. This type of government in which rule is based on religious authority is called a theocracy. The pharaoh stood at the center of Egypt's religion as well as its government and army. Egyptians believed that the pharaoh bore full responsibility for the kingdom's well-being. It was the pharaoh who caused the sun to rise, the Nile to flood, and the crops to grow. It was the pharaoh's duty to promote truth and justice. Egyptians believed that their king ruled even after his death. He had an eternal force, or it was called the Ka, which continued to take part in the governing of Egypt. In Egyptians' minds, the Ka remained much like a living king in its needs and pleasures. Since kings expected to reign forever, their tombs were even more important than their palaces. For the kings of the Old Kingdom, the resting place after death was an immense structure called a pyramid. The Old Pyramid was the great age of pyramid building. The Old Kingdom was the great age of pyramid building in ancient Egypt. These magnificent monuments were remarkable engineering achievements, built by people who had not even begun to use the wheel yet. Unlike Sumerians, however, the Egyptians did have a good supply of stone, both granite and limestone. For the Great Pyramids of Giza, those are the ones you see in front of you here, for example, the limestone facing was quarried just across the Nile. Each perfectly cut stone block weighed at least 2.5 tons. Some weighed 15 tons. More than 2 million of these blocks were stacked with precision to a height of 481 feet. The entire structure covered more than 13 acres. The pyramids also reflect the strength of the Egyptian civilization. They show that in the Old Kingdom, dynasties had developed the economic strength and technological means to support massive public works projects, as well as the leadership and the government organization to carry them out. Practical needs led to many Egyptian inventions. Kind of like the Chinese science was the same way. It ran on practical needs. For example, the Egyptians developed a calendar to help them keep track of the time between the floods and their planting season. Priests observed that the same star, Sirius, appeared above the eastern horizon just before the floods came. So they calculated the number of days between one rising of the star and the next as 365 days, a solar year. They divided this year into 12 months of 30 days each and added 5 days for the holidays and feasting. This calendar was so accurate that it fell short of the true solar by only 6 hours. Egyptians developed a system of written numbers for counting, adding, and subtracting. The system would have helped to assess and collect taxes. Scribes used an early form of geometry to survey and reset property boundaries after the annual floods. Mathematical knowledge helped Egypt's skillful engineers and architects make accurate measurements to construct their remarkable pyramids and palaces. Egyptian architects were the first to use stone columns in homes and palaces and temples. Egyptian medicine was also famous in the ancient world. Egyptian doctors knew how to check a person's heart rate by feeling for a pulse in different parts of the body. They were able to set broken bones with splints and had effective treatments for wounds and fevers. They also used surgery to treat some conditions. The power of the pharaoh declined about 2180 BCE, marking the end of the Old Kingdom. Strong pharaohs regained control during the Middle Kingdom from 2040 to 1640 BCE and restored law and order. They improved trade and transportation by digging a canal from the Nile to the Red Sea. They built huge dikes to trap and channel the Nile's floodwaters for irrigation. They also created thousands of new acres of farmland by draining the swamps of Lower Egypt. The prosperity of the Middle Kingdom did not last, though. In about 1640 BCE, a group from the area of Palestine moved across the Isthmus of Suez into Egypt. These people were the Hyksos, which meant the rulers of foreign lands. The Hyksos ruled much of Egypt from 1630 to 1523 BCE. Egypt would rise again for a new period of power and glory in the New Kingdom. During approximately the same time as the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom existed in Egypt, civilization was emerging in the Indus River Valley.